I've been thinking a lot about what to say to you and how to kick this off, because much of this is going to be Q&A. And I thought what I'd do is, people ask me the same questions often. You know, how'd you get started? How do you do this or that in speech writing? And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through a list of questions that you might have and that most audiences have. And I thought that would get us started, because we'll get through those questions and then we can talk about what you want to ask on top of that, okay? I'm thinking I'll have about six questions. So the first question people ask me is, how did you become a speechwriter to the President of the United States? Is that a fair enough question? And they called. Most speechwriters to the president come from one of several backgrounds. In our White House, in our staff, we had two people, three people at one, a fair number of people. We had a total of 14 in the 8 years that Mr. Reagan was in the White House. I was one of those 14. And a number of them had been journalists. One had worked for one of the national television networks called CBS. Another had won a Pulitzer Prize, which is the highest prize in American journalism, for excellence in American journalism. Another had written editorials. Editorial writing is very good as a background for presidential speech writing. The one who'd worked in CBS had essentially written editorials for them. Because you're constructing an argument, and that's a lot about what speech writing is about. Others had worked in government before at the cabinet level, which is to say the people reporting directly to the president who head bureaus, or in some other form in government. We had someone who had been a speechwriter for the Secretary of the Treasury in the prior Republican administration, then written for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and then went to the White House. So you can see there was quite a big background. We had several people who had worked for President Nixon and Ford before, and they were brought in, and most of those were gone fairly early because they were older and they were helping set up. I had none of that. I had been working as a freelance writer in New York, as well as doing some other things, and worked on as a volunteer on the Reagan campaign in 1980, actually starting in 1979. I walked in the door, I licked stamps, I answered phone calls. When they wanted somebody to go out and knock on doors and say, "Would you vote for us?" I was one of those people. I started as the most junior of volunteers. But in the course of the campaign, one thing led to another, and there were quite a few people who felt I should be in the administration. After about a year, I was invited to be part of a group that was looking at the management of the federal government, not paid. I would go down to Washington, I'd do the work we did. Most of the people were with large corporations. The person I was helping with this was head of a magazine, actually, and had been on Wall Street. And then when I went down to Washington, I'd stop in on people who were in the campaign. And they'd asked me to go. As it turned out, they were in the White House and other places. And they asked one of these days, one of them asked me to go see someone, and then someone else at the next trip, and someone else the next trip. And I found myself invited to join the administration in urban policy questions, federal U.S. government policy towards cities, American cities. After a few months, somebody else came to me and said, "Well, I'd like you to work over here." And over here was in international economic policy, trade, and mostly trade, some finance. In this period, I got to know one of the vice president's speechwriters. Now, you know, President Reagan's vice president was later President Bush. And this fellow said, well, started calling me up because I had a lot of policy background and asking for advice on speeches. Should we say this? Should we say this? Could you give me some background on that? And one day he said, well, we're looking for a new speechwriter. Do you know anyone? Of course, I was bright, eager, ambitious, right? I said, no, I don't know anyone. Even now, I wonder. But a few weeks later, he came back to me and he said, we're looking for a new speechwriter. Do you know anyone? I knew opportunity never knocked twice. You seize the moment. You must move with the moment. I said no again. And the third time, he asked me a third time, and I said no a third time. But you know, you hit a mule. This is a phrase they have in Texas, Mr. Bush's home state. It's if you hit a mule over the head enough times, pretty soon you get its attention. And the fourth time he said that, I said, well, I'd sort of been thinking of applying for that. He said, you ought to, which was probably a hint. Could have given me a clue at what he meant all along. So I went through a series of interviews, and somehow they selected me. And I was told I was to meet the vice president, and somebody said, you just get across the floor, don't fall on your face, you've got the job. But I was taking no chances. The night before, I'd gone out and I'd got a new shirt, a new tie, a haircut. At that time, a haircut was really unusual. And I was ushered in that morning to the vice president's office. Now, the vice president's office is in a building next to the White House that dates back to the mid-19th century. And the room is about, if you take this room and you have 4 of them, that's the size of the room, and then it's twice as high, the ceiling. And so it's a very grand room. Now, shrinking it, you're about where the desk is. And there's a rug the desk is on. And they ushered me in, and I was determined to make a good impression. So I go marching across that floor, as you would, holding out my hand, saying, hello, Mr. Bush, I'm Clark Judge. And as I said Judge, my foot caught on the rug, and I went flying across the desk. Even now, I can see myself face down on the desk. And I looked up, and he had a look on his face like, my staff has done it again. But he showed a politician's instinct for survival. He made me do the safest thing I could. He asked me to sit down. And after we talked for a while, he said, well, I want this, my staff wants it, I hope you'll do it. I thought, he's asking? I said, I thought I could find the time. And that's how I became a speechwriter. And about 2.5 years later, the president's writers came to me one by one and said, we have an opening on this staff. We'd like you to be the guy, and one thing led to another, and I was. So you might say that this is where the bad pun comes. I fell into the job. So that's how I became a speechwriter. As I say, it's not usual, particularly tripping on your first interview. People ask me, what was it like working for those 2 men? Each of them was very gracious. Each of them was very principled. Each of them had a clear sense of what he wanted to do for the country and for the world. one of our principal tasks was to bring down communism, and each was dedicated to that task. And it informed everything they did in the administration. It informed a great deal of what we did as speechwriters in the administration. One of my colleagues said, we had Soviets came over for a summit in one of the years, and they were over a couple of times, and one of my colleagues said, had one of them over to his office, and he was showing him the word processing. The guy said, well, we have nothing like that. What do you do with all the extra time? And he said, we think about how to make life hard for you. So that was, but that was what we were focused on, as well as the revival of the American economy and expanding the reach of freedom in the United States. We were focused on the bringing down the Soviets. People ask me, well, okay, the two men, we know what they're like, but what is their style? What was their speaking style? And I think of the speaking style, I'm now going to talk not just about Mr. Reagan and Mr. Bush, but also presidents since then. I think of presidential speaking styles in terms of music. President Reagan was symphonic. He had an ability to reach all of the variations of emotion and meaning, of nuance, bring them in, make them full, handle them with his voice and with his presentation exactly as you'd want, and even more. I saw early on with him that I had put a particular phrase in a speech. It was clear what it meant. It was more than a phrase, it was a paragraph. It was clear what it meant. When it came out of his mouth, the words were exactly the same, but the meaning was different. He had reached into the text and teased out more meaning. Many of the writers said, well, he got two laughs on a joke when I put in only one. He did the same thing with humor. So he was symphonic. Later President Bush was rock and roll. Simple driving beats, a particular kind of rhythm, and very simple. Now, I like symphonies, I like rock and roll. Each is effective, they're different. President Clinton is like improvisational jazz. Each of the sections of his speeches would be brilliant riffs, and in fact, I was saying this once in front of an audience with one of his speechwriters present, and his speechwriter said, yeah, we referred to the section of speeches as riffs. You know the term riff? Does this mean something? It's a term in music, and particularly jazz, of where this is where you're a whole musical line. And particularly when you're improvising, which, as it happens, President Clinton did a fair amount of. The riffs didn't always line up with one another. He'd say things in one that contradicted what he had in another, but each was brilliant in itself. President Bush. President Bush was much like country music. Now, I know that being Texan and all, you'd expect that, but country music has very, very strong structure. You see that structure repeating over and over again. His speeches had extremely strong structure and a note of evangelical lyricism. And that was President Bush's style. And President Clinton, I think of President Obama. I think of President Obama as having two styles. One of them is urban jazz. You know, the long pauses, you know, the low level of emotion, the rationality, that essentially defines urban jazz. The other, You think of his, did you see him during the election, particularly the night he was reelected, and his speech in the big park in Chicago? Did any of you see this? A fair number of you are nodding your head. That was very emotional, and it had big builds, and there was a feeling of almost calling the audience to respond. That's very much like gospel music. And those are the two musical forms that I think of as President Obama. All of those are fine musical forms. Each, as it happens, lines up with some of the personality of the man. But I don't think they thought it through in terms of, I'm going to speak, based on, taking country music or taking rock and roll as my. I think this is rather that the styles reflected their personalities, and they infused it in one way or another, and out came that particular style. Now, people ask me, how has presidential speechwriting changed since I was in the White House? And there's one very big change, which you hear presidential speechwriters talking about. I don't know if it's true here, but when we were in office, the United States had 3 networks, major television networks, and a couple of sources of radio coverage, big sources of radio coverage. And we also had a few defining newspapers. It was before cable. In the United States now you have 5, 6, if you count the business channels, 6 all news all the time channels. You have as well those 3 network or broadcast channels, and you have a channel devoted entirely to public affairs. In other words, there's a lot of television, there's a lot of radio coverage. You have the blogs, so you have a tremendous amount of sources of print, essentially, coverage. And so there's vastly more coverage now. When we were in the White House, those 3 networks you got, they would cover you, and what they would cover of your speeches were generally ran about 10 to 20 seconds, period, if you were lucky. And that was for radio and television both. That length of time had come down significantly over the years. In the mid-'60s, someone said it was 1.5 minutes that you'd get. By the time we were in the White House, it was a sentence or a sentence and a half. And so there was tremendous pressure on us to write sentences as part of our overall argument that would be picked up by television and radio and newspapers. These, in the business, are called sound bites, memorable phrases. And we had a press that wasn't particularly friendly towards us for the most part, that wouldn't be reflecting our views in their coverage, and so we were including in our speeches phrases that sentences that we thought would be so attractive to them just by the way they sounded that they'd pick them up, build their stories around them, and we'd get, at least through that phrase, our message through. Now, I'll give you some examples. One way of getting picked up is to give something a name, an idea a name, particularly if it relates to popular culture. One of those names, I'm sure you've heard, was Evil Empire. The president said in a speech, he had that as the term for the Soviet Union and the countries under its subjugation, those countries that were part of its empire. It also, at that time, there were 2 advantages for picking that up, 3 really. One is it spoke a truth. The second is that it had a certain amount of popular culture reference. Star Wars had come out at that time. The whole idea of Darth Vader, and does this ring a bell with you? I mean, it's sort of, you get the feeling. So that made it also appealing to the press. And the third was, they found it outrageous. And if you don't say that, silence was a big part of part of what we were doing was speaking truth that people wouldn't speak. And so those three, it became an electric phrase that then defined the Soviet Union for much of for the rest of its existence. But that was a classic soundbite. Give something a name, have it reference to popular culture, have a certain amount of outrageousness to it. That's a classic soundbite. Another classic sound way of getting quoted is using some of those devices, but doing it in a series of three. If you know, there are a lot in history. If you know Julius Caesar, the beginning of his history of the Gallic Wars, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. Does this ring a bell with you? It's well over, it's more 2,000 years since he wrote it, but it's still a commonly known phrase, a series of three: the kingdom, the power, and the glory, which is at least often used at the end of the Lord's Prayer. These are classic series of three. They get quoted, they get remembered. Another is to have a contrast, not this, but this. If you know John Kennedy's inaugural address, ask not what you can do for your country, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Have you heard that? Does this ring a bell too? Very famous. That's a contrast. Not this, but this. Or another structuring of that would be two no's. Not this, but this. Those typically get quoted. There was in fact a professor at Oxford University in Britain who studied applause lines and sound bites and found that most of them had that kind of structure, either 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, and a twist, 3. So sound bites have gone away because of the use of sound bites has gone way down because of technology, because speechwriters aren't under the same pressure to get that pickup in the media, because now with cable television and with the internet, so much of speeches are covered. We've gone from 10 seconds to really 20 minutes, which will appear, in other words, entire speeches. Now, the first candidate, I'm going to say a bit about, off my script, but the first candidate to pick up on this difference was Barack Obama. In the year 2008, when he first ran for president, there were a series of primaries in the Democratic Party race. Now, a primary, you know what primaries are. It's when the candidates for one party are running for their nomination, and they go state by state, and the winner wins the delegates from that state. And this was a close race, to the point that one week Mrs. Clinton, his principal opponent, would win. The next week he would win. The next week she would win. These were basically one a week, although sometimes there were several times each week, several on one night. They were all on Tuesdays, which is election day in the United States. Most elections are held on Tuesdays. And so it went back and forth. And each of these nights, the loser would come out first. They'd be in different places, but they would agree generally that the loser would come out first, unless the loser took too much time to come out, concede, say a few words, maybe, and then the winner would come out. And they'd each have about 10 minutes. Now, Mrs. Clinton would come out and do what was traditional in the United States on an election night. she'd thank this person and that person and that person. This is what politicians, I don't know if they do it here, but in the United States, they typically go through a list of the people who've been for them and thank them for their help. And by the time she was done with that, she was 5 to 10 minutes into the speech, and she was cut off by the networks, and they were over to Mr. Obama. And even if she was second and won that week, they would still cut her off because they'd give each one the same amount of time. They wouldn't favor either one. Well, she had got none of her message out. Mr. Obama would come out, and he would dispense with that. And he'd go immediately into, this is what this election means, this is what this victory means, this is what we're trying to do for the country, this is where we're taking it. And by the time they cut it off, the networks, the news networks, he would have got everything he had to say out. And who's watching on primary nights? A lot of it is people in your own party waiting, who are going to be in voting in primaries later in the year. So he had got his message to all of those people on that night just by the way he structured his speech. So lack of sound, absence of sound bites, and also a sense of how your coverage goes. Those are the changes. How the technological changes have changed the way you're going to be covered. Those are the changes in presidential speechwriting. Now, people ask me, how do you write humor? And this is not an unusual question for speechwriters. In fact, it's an old question. There's a story about Christ walking down a street, or down a road. And he comes upon a man who's sitting by the road crying. And he leans down and says to the man, "My son, why are you crying?" And the man says, "Because I am blind and cannot see." Christ said, that's no reason to cry. He lays on his hands, the man's eyes come to light. He jumps up, says, "Thank you, Lord, thank you," and he runs into town to tell his friends. Christ walks a little further. He says, there's another man at the side of the road crying. Christ says, "Why are you crying?" The man says, "Because I'm crippled and I cannot walk." He says, "That's no reason to cry," and he lays on his hands, and the man's legs come to life, and he runs into town. Jumps up and says, "Thank you, Lord, thank you, thank you, thank you," and he runs into town to tell his friends. These stories always have three. Christ walks a little further. There's another man. He's crying too. Isn't that a coincidence? And Christ says, again, "Why are you crying?" And the man says, "Because I'm a speechwriter and I can't think of any jokes." So Christ sat down and cried with him. Jokes are always tough. You were supposed to laugh louder for that one. Jokes are always tough. But the structure of a joke is just like the structure of that story, and like the structure I described for a soundbite. Setup, twist. The twist is an element of the surprising or outrageous. Blind, crippled, speechwriter, can't think of a joke. That is a typical structure of a joke. The two setups and then the line with the twist. And that one had two twists. Charlie Chaplin talked about this. Now, Charlie Chaplin did primarily silent movies. He said that here's what humor is. He said humor is you have a shot of a woman walking down the street. You cut to a banana peel. You cut back to the woman walking down the street. You cut back to the banana peel. Now, notice those are two. The woman, the banana peel, that's one. The woman again, the banana peel, that's two, right? You go back to the woman as she's walking, and she's just about to step on the banana when she sees it, steps to the side, and falls down a manhole that she couldn't see, and neither did you. And that, he said, is humor. That's how you write humor. That's the structure of humor. Now, there are others, but basically it's that woman, banana peel, once or twice. The twice sets up a certain amount of expectation, higher expectation and tension, and then the surprise, which is also in that case outrageous. So set up, twist. Now, people ask me, what's your greatest speech? The greatest speech you ever wrote? You're nodding your head. And I say, there are so many. But the fact is, I don't talk about the speeches I wrote. But I'll talk to you about a speech somebody else on our staff wrote, which is also now the signature speech of the administration, tear down this wall. And the fellow who wrote it, who also is affiliated with the firm I'm in, White House Writers Group, spends most of his time now at the Hoover Institution in Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. He was, at the time, he was asked to go on the trip. He was told he was to write the speech. Wasn't given a lot of direction. But he was sent on the pre-advance. Now, a presidential trip has two pre-trips before the actual trip. The first is a planning trip. That's called the pre-advance. The advance trip is when a staff goes in and they basically put in place everything that was planned. There's always a cameraman, as there is here. But it's not he puts up his tripod. There are platforms that are set up. Somebody has to build the platforms. There are receptions. Somebody has to make sure the food is ready and whatever else at the reception, if there's music, that the band is there, that it's been engaged, that sort of thing. This is true in domestic trips as well as international trips. And Peter Robinson, who is the speechwriter I'm talking about, was sent on the pre-advance. His first stop was with the senior American diplomat in Berlin. Now, this is in itself typical of speech writing in the White House. The first what you want to do before any speech is talk to the people in the government who have a direct interest in the speech, in the policy, who will give you guidance, or people outside of the government who, in one way or another, can give you a sense of your audiences, of how people in the area feel about the issues you're covering. In this case, he stopped first with the senior American diplomat in Berlin, whose advice was, don't talk about the wall. The Europeans are used to the wall. They don't want, Berliners are used to the wall. Europeans think that Reagan is a cowboy. It's embarrassing, don't talk about the wall. I imagine here in Budapest the view was different, but that was the view of the senior American diplomat. That evening, there was a dinner party for Peter. He was a graduate. He had gone, in addition to his American education, to Oxford, and one of his Oxford friends lived in Berlin and had prevailed on someone to open up her house, a woman, and invite Berliners. Same thing I'd said. One, the officials. That's true of every time you do a speech. The other, people who are outside of the government who might give you insight. And that's also part of what we would do regularly. And so these people were probably a lot like your parents. Some were doctors, some were lawyers, some were in business, some were in teaching, lots of different occupations, about 20 people. And as the evening, after the drinks and when everybody was sitting down along a table and they started to talk, Peter said, well, I was told that people don't care about the wall here. What do you think? There was a silence in the room. And then a man down the table said, I haven't seen my sister lives 25 miles to the east. I haven't seen her since the wall went up. What do you think I think about the wall? And somebody else said, I walk to work each day and I pass a guard tower on the other side of the wall. And there's a young man in that guard tower and he has an AK-47, which was the standard issue Soviet rifle, gun. And and I think to myself, this is a zoo. One of us is the zookeeper, the other is the animal, and I don't know which is which. And then the hostess of the evening said, if Mr. Gorbachev is serious, Mr. Gorbachev being the head of the Soviet Union at that time, if Mr. Gorbachev is serious about all this glasnost and perestroika, which were the terms for reform, he'll come here and he'll take down the wall, tear down the wall. So Peter took this back to Washington, wrote the speech with the working with worked particularly hard on that phrase and getting it right, and working with the chief speechwriter, who was our boss, a fellow named Tony Dolan. And then the speech went. It came the day to meet with the president. Now, understand this about the White House. Typically, the president was the last one to see a speech, because the speeches went back to the agencies and the offices that had an interest in the policy, and the policy they'd sometimes disagree with one another, but the idea was that the disagreements all occurred before the speech got to the president. In my experience, the speeches that the president saw before anyone else all dealt with the Soviet Union. And the president was given this speech, and we were to meet with him before it went into staffing. Came the day to meet with the president. Peter explained there were several speeches to be discussed that day. Peter explained to the president that if the atmospheric conditions were right, you could hear it in Budapest, you could hear it in Prague, you could hear it in throughout Poland, you could even hear it as far to the east as Moscow. Was there anything that the president felt strongly about in the speech? And he said, well, now that's a Reagan imitation, so you're supposed to laugh now. Well, that part about the wall, it should stay in. Now, we were the only ones that knew that the president had seen the speech, other than the head of communications and the national security advisor. But he was essentially saying, you fight for that, and I'll stand behind you. Over the course of the next several weeks, the State Department came back again and again and again with edits on the speech, and every edit had that line out. It even got to the point of the Secretary of State going into the president after there'd been no movement from the speechwriters, and the line was still in. It came to the day before the speech was to be given. The president was at I think at that time it was G7 conference, the economic conference. I think now it's G534 and a half, isn't that right? But that meeting that year was in Venice. And the president was he was staying in a Venetian palace which had a large garden. And he was in the garden working on some papers. And his deputy chief of staff came to him. His name was Ken Duberstein. And said, Mr. President, State Department has come back to us again, and they really want that line out. President looked up at Ken, and he said, "Well, Ken, well, Ken, I am the president, aren't I?" And Ken said, "Yes, sir, yes, you are. And that does mean I get to make these decisions, doesn't it?" And Ken said, "Yes, sir, we're all agreed on that, we know that." "Well, then, it stays in." And in the limousine, on the way to the speech, the president slapped Ken on the knee and said, "The boys at State are going to kill me for this, but it's the right thing to do." And that's how that speech got written and delivered. Now, I want to say one additional thing about that, because it says a lot about speech writing and a lot about speech giving. I've talked to you about technique. I've talked to you about writing memorable phrases, writing humor, other things. They don't matter at the end of the day. I've talked to you about styles. It's important. All those things are important. But at the end of the day, in a larger sense, they don't matter. What matters is what you believe. It's what you're committed to. I said that President Reagan and President Bush came committed to do things, and they believed in them. And they had been elected running for them. And they were standing by the principles and the purposes that they were elected to, that the American people elected them to carry through. They'd been clear about it. There was no fuzziness about what they wanted to do. That's what matters. If you believe, if you're committed, if you're clear and put that across, that's what speech giving is about, that's what speech writing is about. And that's what politics in any place, elected politics, is about. It's what you believe in and standing for it, even when you're under fire. That's why they were great, and that's why speech writing is a great thing to do if you're working for that kind of person. Thank you.